The rain had been falling on Marlowe House for 3 days, and Alina Vance had learned to read it the way other people read a clock. The soft rain meant the gutters above the east wing would sing their thin, metallic song, and old Mr. Radcliffe would grow restless in his sleep, muttering names of people who had died before Alina was born. The hard rain, the kind that came now, drumming against the tall Georgian windows like impatient fingers, meant the house would grow cold no matter how high the radiators were set, and that she would spend the night moving from room to room with hot water bottles and a wool blanket draped over her arm, tending to a man the rest of his family had already decided was as good as gone. She stood at the foot of the grand staircase, a tray balanced against her hip, and listened. Somewhere above her, in the vast quiet of the upper floors, Thomas Radcliffe was dying. Not tonight, perhaps not for weeks, but dying all the same in the slow, dignified, infuriating way of men who had spent their lives refusing to be told what to do. He was 91 years old. He had built a shipping empire from a single leased freighter and a stubborn refusal to accept that a working-class boy from Hartlepool had no business among the men who owned the sea. He had buried a wife, 2 brothers, and more business rivals than he could name. And now he lay in a 4-poster bed the size of a small boat, kept alive by machines he despised, and a woman he had, in his more lucid hours, come to trust more than anyone else in the world. That woman was Alina. The tray she carried held a small pot of tea, a single slice of dry toast cut into precise triangles, and a folded copy of the Financial Times, 3 days old, because Thomas liked to be read the shipping figures even when he could no longer follow them. It was 11 o'clock at night. She had been on her feet since 6 that morning. Her lower back ached in the specific, grinding way she had grown used to over 11 years of lifting, turning, bathing, and carrying people who could no longer carry themselves, and her hands were dry and cracked from the endless washing, and she was, she supposed, tired in a way that had stopped feeling like a temporary condition and started feeling like a fact about herself, the way her brown eyes were a fact, or her steadiness under pressure. But she did not feel sorry for herself. That was a habit she had abandoned a long time ago, somewhere in a hospital corridor in another city, in another life, back when she had still answered to a different name and worn a different kind of coat. She climbed the stairs. The Radcliffes had lived at Marlowe House for 4 generations, and every generation had left its mark on the place like sediment. The portraits in the stairwell told the story if you knew how to read them. Severe Victorian shipbuilders with mutton-chop whiskers giving way to soft-jawed Edwardians in yachting blazers, then to the sharp-suited men of the post-war boom, and finally to Thomas himself, painted at 60 in a dark suit with his hand resting on a globe, looking out of the canvas with an expression that Alina had come, over many long nights, to understand completely. It was the expression of a man who had learned to expect betrayal and had decided, quite calmly, to survive it anyway. His descendants had not inherited that expression. They had inherited only the appetite. She reached the landing and pushed open the door to the master bedroom, and the smell of the sick room met her, antiseptic and lavender and the faint sweetness of a body slowly failing, and beneath it tonight something else. Cigar smoke. Alina stopped. Thomas was forbidden cigars. His heart could not take them, his lungs could not take them, and he had, 3 months ago, promised her with tears of frustration in his eyes that he would not ask her to bring him one again. She believed him. Thomas did not break promises to her. Which meant someone else was in the house. She set the tray down on the hall table, very quietly, and stepped into the room. He was sitting in the chair by the window, not Thomas, who lay small and still in the great bed, but a man of perhaps 55, well-fed and expensively dressed, with the smooth, uncreased face of someone who had never once in his life been forced to sit up all night with a dying stranger. He had a cigar in one hand and a crystal tumbler of Thomas's 40-year-old whiskey in the other, and he was looking at the old man in the bed with an expression of frank, unhurried calculation, the way a buyer looks at a horse he intends to purchase cheaply. This was Julian Radcliffe, Thomas's nephew, and since the death of Thomas's own son 8 years earlier, the man who fully expected to inherit everything. "You must be the nurse," Julian said without looking at her. "I'm Mr. Radcliffe's carer," Eleanor said. "Eleanor Vance." He turned the cigar slowly, admiring the ash. "The famous Eleanor. My cousin Diana speaks of you often, usually to complain about how much you cost." He smiled then, and it was a practiced smile, the kind that had closed 1,000 deals and comforted no one. "Though I must say, for the money, one expects a certain level of vigilance. And yet here I am, in the sick room, with a cigar, and you didn't hear a thing until you smelled it." Eleanor crossed the room, took the crystal ashtray from the sideboard where it had sat unused for 3 months, and held it out to him. "He can't be around smoke," she said. "It affects his breathing. If you'd like to smoke, the terrace is through the library." Julian looked at the ashtray. He looked at her, and something passed across his smooth face, not anger exactly, but a kind of astonished recalibration, the look of a man who has spoken to a piece of furniture and been startled to hear it answer back. "Do you know," he said softly, "I don't believe I asked for your opinion." "You're not being asked for one either," Eleanor said. "I'm telling you the medical facts. What you do with them is your business, but you'll do it away from my patient." For a long moment neither of them moved. Rain lashed the windows. In the bed, Thomas Radcliffe stirred and his cracked lips parted, and in a voice like dry paper he said, "Eleanor." "I'm here," she said, not taking her eyes off Julian. "Go back to sleep, Mr. Radcliffe, everything's fine." Julian rose. He was taller than she had expected, and he used the height, stepping close so that she had to tilt her chin to hold his gaze. He smelled of cigar smoke and cologne, and the particular confidence of inherited money. "Let me explain something to you, Miss Vance," he said very quietly so as not to wake the old man, and Eleanor noted that, filed it away, the fact that even now he was calculating, protecting the appearance of things. "In a matter of weeks, possibly days, everything in this house is going to belong to my family. This house, that whiskey, that bed, and every contract of employment attached to the estate, including yours, will be reviewed, personally, by me." He let that settle. "So I would think very carefully, if I were you, about the tone you take with the people who are about to sign your checks." Eleanor set the ashtray down on the sideboard. "Mr. Radcliffe needs his medication at midnight," she said. "I have to prepare it now. You know your way out." And she turned her back on him, deliberately, completely, the way you turn your back on a dog you refuse to let smell your fear, and went to the medicine cabinet, and began, with steady hands, to count out the evening's pills. Behind her, after a long silence, she heard Julian Radcliffe laugh softly to himself. Then his footsteps crossed the room, and the door opened and closed, and he was gone. She let out a slow breath. From the bed in the darkness, Thomas said, "He's a jackal, that one." Eleanor turned. The old man's eyes were open, pale, watery, but fixed on her with startling clarity. In the long stretches of his illness, lucidity came and went like weather, and she had learned to treasure it when it arrived. "You're awake," she said, coming to sit on the edge of the bed. "I've been awake the whole time," a dry rasp that might have been a chuckle. "I wanted to see what you'd do." He studied her face. "You didn't flinch." "He's not the first frightened man to try and frighten me." "No," Thomas's gaze drifted toward the door through which his nephew had gone. "They're all frightened, you know. Julian, Diana, my grandnephew, that ridiculous boy with the sports cars. They circle this bed like they're waiting for something, and they think I don't see them." He closed his eyes. "I see everything, Eleanor. I always have. It's the only reason I'm not still hauling rope in Hartlepool." She reached for the glass of water on the nightstand and helped him drink, one hand cradling the back of his skull, which was as fragile now as a bird's. When he had finished, he lay back, breathing carefully, gathering himself. "They think the money makes them powerful," he said. It doesn't. Money is just the scoreboard. The game is something else entirely. His eyes opened again, and now there was something in them she had not seen before, something sharp and appraising, the ghost of the man who had stared out of that portrait with his hand on the globe. You know what the game is, don't you, Alina? I've watched you for 2 years now. You know exactly what it is. Alina said nothing. Where did you learn it? Thomas asked. That stillness, that way you have of standing in a room and giving nothing away, that's not something they teach in a nursing college. For a moment, just a moment, Alina's careful composure wavered. It was late, and she was tired, and the old man's eyes were so unbearably kind and so unbearably knowing that she felt, for the first time in a very long time, the pull of the truth, the way you feel the pull of deep water when you've been treading it too long. But she had survived this long by not answering that question. You should rest, Mr. Radcliffe, she said gently, and smoothed the blanket over his chest. He caught her wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes were not. There's going to be a war in this house when I'm gone, he said. Over the money, over the company, over all of it. And those jackals are going to lose Alina, every one of them, because I have made arrangements they cannot begin to imagine. A slow, terrible smile. And you are going to be right in the middle of it. So I need to know, before it's too late, I need to know who I've actually got sitting at my bedside. The rain drummed on. Somewhere below, a door closed, and Alina Vance looked down at the dying man who had seen straight through 11 years of careful disguise, and felt the ground she had built her new life on begin, very slightly, to shift. Not tonight, she said quietly, but soon, I promise. Thomas held her gaze a moment longer. Then, satisfied, or perhaps merely exhausted, he released her wrist and let his head fall back against the pillows. Soon, he agreed. We're both running out of it, you and I, though for different reasons. His eyes closed. Read me the shipping figures, would you? The old ones. I don't want to know what's happening now. I want to know what happened when I still knew how to win. And so Alina opened the 3-day-old newspaper, and in a low, even voice she read him columns of numbers he could no longer parse, until his breathing slowed and deepened, and he slid down into sleep. And she sat in the dark beside him, the paper open in her lap, listening to the rain, and thinking about a promise she had just made that she was not at all sure she could keep. She did not go to bed that night. She rarely did, not properly. Her room was a small conversion off the old servant's passage on the ground floor, and she kept it as spare and clean as a monk's cell. A narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a single shelf of books, and a locked steel box beneath the floorboards that no one in the house knew existed. Instead of sleeping, she sat in the kitchen at the long scrubbed pine table with a mug of tea going cold in front of her, and she thought. She thought about Julian Radcliffe and the cold calculation in his eyes. She thought about the will, whatever it said, and the war Thomas had promised was coming. And she thought, as she had trained herself not to do, about the woman she had been before she became Alina Vance, before the false name, before the carer's uniform, before she had made herself small and quiet and invisible, and had learned to be underestimated as a survival skill, the way some animals learn to play dead. There had been a different life once, a tall building of glass and steel in the city, a corner office, her name, her real name, on documents that moved sums of money the Radcliffe family, for all their yachts and mansions, could not have comprehended. There had been a reputation, hard-won and formidable. There had been enemies. And there had been, at the end of it, a single catastrophic morning, when everything she had built had been taken from her in the space of a few hours by people who had smiled at her right up until the moment they destroyed her. People who were, even now, still out there, still powerful, still believing that she was finished. She had let them believe it. That had been the whole strategy. You cannot betray a dead woman. You cannot fear a ghost. So Alina had let the woman she used to be die a quiet death, and she had walked out of that life carrying nothing but a locked steel box and a certainty, held deep in the coldest part of herself, that one day, not soon, but one day she would walk back in. She had not expected the road back to run through a dying shipping magnate's bedroom. But Thomas Radcliffe had seen her. That was the thing that would not let her sleep. In 2 years, 100 people had passed through this house, family, doctors, solicitors, businessmen, and every one of them had looked at Alina and seen exactly what she wanted them to see. A competent, unremarkable, replaceable woman in a carer's uniform. Furniture that fetched the tea. Only Thomas, the old jackal fighter himself, had looked past the disguise and seen the animal underneath. I need to know who I've actually got sitting at my bedside. She wrapped her cold hands around the colder mug, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to remember the name she had buried. Then she heard the sound. It was small, a soft, deliberate click from the direction of the study at the far end of the ground floor corridor. The study was Thomas's private domain, kept locked, and no one but Alina and Thomas's ancient solicitor, Mr. Ashworth, was permitted a key. Thomas was asleep upstairs. Ashworth was 70 miles away in London, which meant that someone was in a room they had no right to be in, at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, and they were trying very hard to be quiet about it. Alina rose from the table without a sound. 11 years of moving through sick rooms at night had made her silent as smoke. She crossed the kitchen, eased open the door to the corridor, and moved down it in the darkness, her bare feet noiseless on the cold flagstones, until she stood outside the study door. A thin blade of light showed beneath it, a torch held low. She heard the rustle of papers, the slide of a drawer, and then a voice, female, low, hurried, speaking into a phone. "I'm telling you it's not here. I've been through the whole desk. If the old man changed the will, the copy isn't in the house." A pause. No, listen to me. If Julian gets to Ashworth first, we are finished, do you understand? Everything goes to him, we get nothing. Another pause, and now the voice cracked with something between fury and fear. "Then we find the carer. She's with him every hour of every day. If anyone knows what the old man's planning, it's her. And believe me, a woman like that on a carer's wage, she'll have a price." Alina stood in the dark corridor, listening to the Radcliffe family plot the purchase of her loyalty, and felt the cold, familiar calm settle over her like a coat she had not worn in years. They thought she had a price. They had no idea what they were dealing with. She stepped back from the door, silent as a shadow, and returned to the kitchen to think, because the war Thomas had promised had not waited for him to die after all. It had already begun. The next morning came gray and washed out, the storm having spent itself in the small hours, and Alina served breakfast in the morning room to a family that did not know she had heard them in the night. There were 4 of them at the long table. Diana Radcliffe sat at its head, in the chair that Thomas himself had occupied before his illness, and Alina understood the choice of seat perfectly. Diana was Thomas's niece, Julian's younger sister, a handsome, brittle woman of 50 with her uncle's sharp cheekbones and none of his warmth, dressed this morning in charcoal cashmere and a string of pearls that Alina recognized as having come from the safe in the master bedroom. She had a way of holding her coffee cup that suggested she believed the whole world was a fraction too slow in serving her, and when Alina set the toast rack before her, she did not look up or speak, but merely gave a small, dismissive flick of 2 fingers, as though brushing away a fly. It had been Diana's voice in the study. Beside her sat Julian, freshly shaven, the previous night's menace tucked back beneath a veneer of cordial boredom. He gave Alina a smile that did not reach his eyes and said, "Ah, the vigilant Miss Vance," in a tone that made Diana glance up at last, sharply, from her sister to the carer and back again, and Alina saw the flicker of a private, poisonous understanding pass between the siblings. So Julian had told her about the encounter in the sick room. They were, then, at least nominally allied, the 2 of them against Thomas's other heirs, against the solicitor, against whatever the old man had planned. But there had been that phone call. If Julian gets to Ashworth first, we are finished. Diana had been afraid of her own brother, allied and at war with each other in the same breath. Alina filed it away. The third figure at the table was younger, a soft, sullen man of perhaps 28 named Rupert, Diana's son, who wore a great deal of money badly and spent the meal scrolling through his phone with the vacant absorption of a man who had never once been required to be useful. He was the grandnephew with the sports cars. Eleanor had cleaned up after him twice in 2 years and had formed no higher opinion of him than the necessary one. And the fourth was a woman Eleanor had not seen before. She sat slightly apart from the others, near the window, and she was different from them in a way that was immediately, quietly apparent. She was younger than Diana, perhaps 40, plainly dressed, with tired eyes and an air of someone who had come a long way and was not certain of her welcome. When Eleanor entered, this woman had been the only one to say, softly, "Thank you," and Diana had looked at her the way you look at a stain. "Eleanor," Diana said now in the clipped voice of someone issuing an instruction to staff, "this is my cousin Catherine. She has come to help with Uncle Thomas." The pause before help was a small, elegant knife. "She'll want to see him this morning. You'll arrange it." "Of course," Eleanor said. "Though Mr. Radcliffe had a difficult night, I'll see how he is after his medication. If he's strong enough for visitors, I'll come and find you." "You'll bring her up when I say she may go up," Diana corrected, without heat, simply establishing the order of things. "I'll bring her up when it's safe for my patient," Eleanor said, in exactly the same tone, and poured the coffee, and the small silence that followed had a texture to it, a held breath, because everyone at the table had just heard the staff decline to be managed and was waiting to see what Diana would do about it. What Diana did was smile, a thin, wintry smile, and say, "You're quite devoted to him, aren't you? It's touching. I do hope when all this is settled that devotion is properly recognized." And she let the sentence hang there, gleaming, a coin held out across the table. It was, Eleanor understood, the first offer, delivered in daylight in front of witnesses, deniable as anything. "There will be money. Be on the right side of it." "Mr. Radcliffe has always been very fair with me," Eleanor said, which was true and meant nothing and gave them nothing, and she withdrew from the room before Diana could sharpen the point any further. Behind her, as the door swung shut, she heard Rupert say, not quietly enough, "God, the air's on the hired help," and Julian's low answering murmur, and then Catherine's soft voice cutting across them both, unexpectedly clear. "She's the only person in this house who's actually looking after him. I'd mind how you speak to her." And the silence that met that was of an entirely different quality, cold and startled and dangerous, and Eleanor, standing in the corridor with the empty coffee pot in her hand, thought, "There, that one, Catherine. In a house full of jackals, someone had just shown a spine. It was worth knowing who." Upstairs, Thomas was awake and clear-eyed, and in a temper. "They're all here, aren't they?" he said before she had even reached the bed. "I can feel them, the whole pack. I can feel them through the floor." He let her plump the pillows behind him, submitting to it with the bad grace of a man who hated being handled and had run out of ways to refuse. "Who's come?" "Diana, Julian, Rupert." Eleanor measured out his tablets, "and a woman called Catherine." "Your cousin," Diana said. Something changed in the old man's face. "Catherine's here." "You know her?" "Catherine?" He said the name slowly, and for a moment the anger drained out of him and left something older and sadder in its place. "She's my great-niece, my brother Edward's granddaughter. The others treat her like a poor relation because that's what she is. Edward married badly in their view, married a schoolteacher, and the money never came down that branch of the family. He accepted the pills, the water, swallowed with effort. She's the only one of them worth a damn. Which is precisely why they've frozen her out." A dry, humorless laugh. "The Radcliffe family has a genius for despising exactly the people it ought to value. It's practically the motto." Eleanor said nothing, but something in her went very still, because he might have been describing her own history in a single sentence. Thomas caught it, of course he did. His eyes came up to her face, that terrible, penetrating clarity in them again. "Sit down," he said. "The pills will hold them off for an hour. That's an hour we have." He gestured at the chair. "Last night you promised me the truth. Soon, you said. Alina, I don't have the luxury of soon anymore. Look at me. I could go tonight. I could go this afternoon. And before I do, I need to make an arrangement, and I cannot make it in the dark." He drew a slow, rattling breath. "So, I'll go first to show you it's safe. I'll tell you what I've done, and then you'll tell me who you are. And we'll see if the two things fit together the way I think they do." Alina sat. Rain light filled the room, pale and even. Somewhere below, a door closed. The pack was moving through the house, and the old man in the bed folded his fragile hands together and began, in his dry paper voice, to tell her about the will. "Everyone in this house," he said, "believes they know what's in it. Julian believes he inherits the estate and the controlling interest in the company, because he's the eldest male, and because he spent 10 years telling everyone so until they came to accept it as weather. Diana believes she and Rupert take the London properties and a large enough share of the shipping stock to matter. They've all built their futures on a document none of them has read." He smiled, and it was, briefly, the smile of the man in the portrait. "Because the document they think exists, the one Ashworth drew up 6 years ago, is not the document that will be read when I'm gone." Alina went very still. "I changed it," Thomas said, quietly. 8 months ago, when I first understood which way this was going. I had Ashworth draw up a new will, and I signed it, and it is witnessed and sealed and lodged where none of these vultures can get at it. And in that will," he paused, and his eyes glittered, "in that will, I have done something that is going to detonate in this house like a bomb. Because I have spent 2 years watching my own blood relations wait for me to die, and I have spent those same 2 years watching one woman look after me as though I were a person and not an inheritance, and I am old enough and rich enough and near enough to the end to do exactly as I please with what I built." He reached out and took her hand. "I've left it to you, Alina, Marlowe House, and a great deal more than the house." The room seemed to tilt very slightly. "You can't," Alina said, and heard her own voice come out low and strange. "Thomas, you can't do that. They'll contest it. They'll destroy it. They'll say I coerced a dying man, an old man with dementia. They'll say I—" "They'll try," Thomas agreed with tremendous satisfaction. "Oh, they'll try. Which is exactly why I've been so careful. Video, Alina. Ashworth filmed the signing. 2 doctors, not mine, independent men from London, assessed my competence that same day and put it in writing. Every legal spike a jackal could throw itself onto I have laid and buried and marked on a map." The satisfaction faded, and he gripped her hand harder. "But there's a piece I couldn't secure, and it's the piece I need you for, because a will can be attacked in court for years. Money can be tied up, frozen, bled away by lawyers until there's nothing left to fight over. Julian knows this. It's how his sort win, not by being right, but by making it too expensive to oppose them. He'll drown you in litigation. A carer alone against the Radcliffe fortune." He shook his head. "They'll break you inside a year and take back everything, and I'll have handed you a curse instead of a gift." He drew a breath and fixed her with everything he had left. "Unless," he said, "the carer isn't what they think she is. Unless the woman they intend to break has money of her own, and lawyers of her own, and knows this world, their world, the world of contracts and holdings and hostile takeovers, well enough to fight them in it and win." His eyes searched her face. "Last night I asked you where you learned to stand so still. I've been in rooms with the most dangerous people in British commerce for 60 years, Alina, and I know that stillness when I see it. It isn't a nurse's stillness, it's a predator's. So I'll ask you one more time, and this time I need the answer." His voice dropped almost to nothing. "Who were you before you came here?" And Alina Vance, who had buried her name 11 years ago in a hospital corridor, who had made herself small and quiet and invisible as a matter of survival, who had promised herself she would choose the time and the ground of her return, looked at the dying man who had seen through all of it, and understood that the time had chosen her. She was quiet for a long moment. The rain had stopped entirely now. In the sudden hush, she could hear the old clock on the landing and the blood in her own ears. "My name was never Vance," she said at last. "That's the name I bought, along with the papers and the history and the references, from a man in Lisbon who specialized in helping people disappear." She met his eyes steadily. 11 years ago, I ran an investment fund in the city. Not a large one, but a feared one. I built it from nothing. By the time I was 38, I was managing £4 billion, and I had a reputation for finding the weakness in a company that everyone else had missed and being proven right 18 months later when it collapsed. I made a great many powerful men look like fools. And powerful men, she said, do not forgive that. Thomas was watching her with an expression of dawning, ferocious joy. "They came for me all at once," she went on, and her voice never rose, never trembled. She had rehearsed this confession only to herself in the dark 1,000 times, and it came out now smooth and cold as river stone. A coordinated attack, my 3 biggest investors pulling out on the same morning, a story planted in the financial press, a regulatory inquiry that appeared out of nowhere and was quietly dropped the moment it had done its work. By lunchtime, the fund was finished. By the end of the week, my name was ruined so thoroughly that no one in the city would take my call. They didn't just beat me, Thomas. They erased me. And they did it because I had found something. A rot at the heart of a company they were all invested in. A fraud worth billions. And I had made the mistake of saying so out loud before I could prove it. "And the proof," Thomas whispered. Elena almost smiled. "I never stopped gathering it," she said, "for 11 years, from a carer's room in other people's houses in the hours when my patients slept. They think they killed me. They think I'm a cautionary tale, a woman who flew too high and fell. They have no idea that the woman they buried has spent a decade building the case that will bury them." She looked down at their joined hands, the old magnate's and hers. "I always meant to choose my moment. I didn't expect the moment to arrive in the shape of a will." For a long time, Thomas Radcliffe said nothing. Then he began, softly, wheezingly, to laugh. A real laugh, delighted and astonished. The laugh of a man who has played one final card at the very end of the game and turned it over to find it is exactly the card he needed. "Oh," he said when he could speak. "Oh, they have no idea, do they, what's coming into this house?" He squeezed her hand with what little strength remained to him. "A fund manager, a wolf in a carer's coat, sitting at my bedside for 2 years, and not one of those fools ever looked twice." His eyes shone. "What was it? Your name, your real one? I want to hear it. I want to know the name of the woman. I'm leaving my life's work too." And Elena opened her mouth to tell him. And the bedroom door opened without a knock, and Julian Radcliffe walked in, with Diana a half-step behind him, and a look on both their faces that said they had been standing in the corridor for longer than was safe. And Julian said, in a voice like a closing trap, "Leaving your life's work to whom, uncle?" For a moment, nobody in the room moved. Julian stood just inside the door with his hand still on the handle, and the expression on his smooth face was the one Elena had glimpsed the night before in the sick room. The astonished recalibration of a man discovering that the furniture could speak. Behind him, Diana's gaze went from her uncle to the carer to their joined hands on the counterpane, and Elena watched the woman perform the arithmetic in real time and arrive, wrongly but usefully, at the answer she was most primed to fear. "So this is how it is," Diana said softly, the devoted carer holding the dying man's hand, whispering with him behind locked doors. She stepped fully into the room. "How long, uncle? How long has she been working on you? Weeks? Months?" "From the very first day. I shouldn't wonder, a professional. Sizing up the estate, deciding a nursing wage wasn't worth her trouble when there was so much more to be had." Thomas released Elena's hand, not in guilt, but so that he could push himself higher against the pillows, and Elena saw the old fighter surface in him, the shipping magnate who had stared down harder men than these before either of them was born. "Get out of my bedroom," he said. "Uncle." You walked into my private room without knocking, and you stood in my corridor listening at my door, and now you stand there and insult the one person in this house who has shown me a moment's kindness in 2 years." His voice, thin as it was, cut clean across the room. "You want to know how it is, Diana? I'll tell you how it is. You came here to watch me die and count what falls out of my pockets, all of you, and you've been so busy circling that not one of you noticed you were being watched right back." He was breathing hard now, and Alina moved instinctively toward the oxygen, but he waved her off with a fierce little gesture. "No, let them hear it. Let them hear it from me while I can still say it." "You're not well," Julian said, and his voice had changed, smoothed, softened, gone gentle and reasonable in a way that was somehow far more menacing than Diana's open hostility. "Uncle, you're not well and you're upset and you've had a difficult night. That's all this is. You're tired and you're vulnerable, and this woman," he did not look at Alina, "has positioned herself to take advantage of exactly that. It's not your fault. It happens to elderly people all the time, predatory carers. It's practically an epidemic." He turned then at last to Alina and gave her the smile that had closed 1,000 deals. "But it stops now. Miss Vance, you're dismissed, effective immediately. You'll pack your things and be off the property within the hour, and you'll consider yourself fortunate we're not involving the police." And there it was, delivered in daylight, reasonably, almost kindly, the whole strategy laid bare in a single breath. He's not competent. She's a predator. The will is coerced. Remove the witness before the old man dies. Alina had heard the outline of it in the study at 1 in the morning, and here was the finished article, and she had to concede it was well made. It would play beautifully in a courtroom. A grieving family, a confused old man, a carer who had wormed her way into his affections and, astonishingly, his estate. Any jury in England would want to believe it. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of clean, deniable, devastating attack that had once been used to destroy her. Which meant she knew precisely how to answer it. Alina rose from the chair. She did not hurry. She smoothed the front of her uniform, and when she spoke, her voice was calm and even and entirely without heat, the voice of a professional stating facts. "I'm employed under a contract of service with the Marlowe House estate, not with any individual member of the family," she said. "That contract can be terminated by the estate's legal representative, Mr. Ashworth, or by Mr. Radcliffe himself, who retains full testamentary and legal capacity as assessed by 2 independent consultants 8 months ago, and again, she let this land, 6 weeks ago. It cannot be terminated by you, Mr. Radcliffe, because you have no legal standing to do so. Not yet, possibly not ever." She turned to Diana. "And I'd be careful, if I were you, about the word predatory. It's defamatory, it's actionable, and you've now said it twice in front of witnesses." The silence that followed had weight. Julian's smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes went cold and attentive, and Alina saw him truly look at her for the first time, not at the uniform, not at the role, but at the woman inside it, and she watched the first small seed of doubt take root. That was not how a carer speaks. That was how a lawyer speaks. That was how someone who has been in the room where estates are fought over speaks. "Who," said Julian slowly, "are you?" "I'm Mr. Radcliffe's carer," Alina said, "and I think, Mr. Radcliffe, to Thomas, that your family should leave you to rest now. You've had enough excitement for one morning." But Thomas Radcliffe was not finished. He had spent his life refusing to be told when a fight was over, and he was not about to start now, at the very end, when he held the best hand he had drawn in years. "I'm changing nothing under duress," he said, "and I'm changing nothing at all because it's already done. It was done 8 months ago, in front of Ashworth and a camera and 2 doctors you can't buy, and it's sealed somewhere you'll never find it, and when I'm gone it will be read out in that drawing room downstairs, and every one of you." His gaze swept them, Julian, Diana, and Rupert, who had appeared in the doorway now, phone forgotten, mouth slightly open. "Every one of you is going to learn exactly what I thought of the way you waited for me to die." He sank back, spent, triumphant. "Now get out, all of you, before I have Alina throw you out, and believe me, she can." For a long moment the siblings held their ground, and Alina could see them recalculating, the two of them thinking in parallel. The will is already changed, already sealed, already defended. We cannot stop the signing, it has happened. We can only attack it afterward, attack the mind that made it, attack the woman who benefited, attack, delay, drown, bleed. It was, she thought, precisely the correct conclusion. It was what she would have done in their place. It was also exactly what she had spent 11 years learning how to beat. "This isn't over," Diana said quietly at the door. It was not a threat so much as a statement of fact, and in that at least she and Alina were in perfect agreement. "No," Alina said. "I don't imagine it is." They filed out, Diana first, rigid with fury, then Rupert, gormless and gaping, and last of all Julian, who paused in the doorway and looked back at Alina with an expression she recognized intimately, because she had worn it herself, long ago, across a boardroom table from men who had underestimated her. It was the look of a predator who has just realized that the thing he took for prey has teeth. "I'm going to find out who you are," he said pleasantly. "Everything, every name you've ever used, every place you've ever worked, everywhere you've ever been, and when I do." "I'd start in Lisbon," Alina said. "You'll get further faster." She had no idea why she said it. It was a mistake, a small, uncharacteristic flare of the old arrogance, the wolf showing a flash of teeth for the simple pleasure of it after 11 years of hiding them. She regretted it the instant it left her mouth. Because Julian's eyes sharpened, and he filed it away. She watched him file it away, and then he smiled, and inclined his head as though she had given him a gift and left. Lisbon. She had handed him the one thread that, pulled hard enough, could unravel everything. Alina closed the door behind them and stood with her forehead nearly touching the wood, and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of self-recrimination before she set it aside, because self-recrimination was a luxury and she was, once again, at war. "You shouldn't have told him that," Thomas said from the bed. He had heard, of course. He heard everything. "No," Alina agreed. "I shouldn't have." "Why did you?" She turned. The old man was watching her with tired, knowing eyes. "Because for 11 years," she said slowly, "I've been someone who couldn't afford to be proud, and I suppose some part of me has been waiting a very long time to stop." She crossed back to the bed and began, methodically, to check his pulse, his color, the things that were her actual work. "It won't happen again. Pride is how they beat me the first time. I let them think I was invincible, and I stopped watching my back and they cut it to ribbons. I won't make that mistake twice." Thomas let her tend to him, in silence for a while. Then he said, "You never told me your name." Alina's hands went still on his wrist. Downstairs, faintly, she could hear the family regrouping, the murmur of voices in the morning room, the particular urgent cadence of people making plans. Julian would already be on the phone. To a private investigator, most likely. To Lisbon, eventually. The clock she had been running for 11 years had just begun, at last, to run down toward its final hour, and she found that she was not afraid. She had been getting ready for this for a very long time. She looked down at Thomas Radcliffe, and for the second time that morning she decided to trust him with the truth, the whole of it, the last locked door. "My name," she said, "is—" A knock at the door, soft, tentative, not the family's knock. Alina and Thomas exchanged a glance. Then Alina crossed the room and opened it and found Catherine standing in the corridor. Catherine, the poor relation, the schoolteacher's granddaughter, the one who had told Rupert to mind how he spoke. She was pale, and her hands were twisting together, and she spoke in a rushed, low voice as though afraid of being overheard. "I need to talk to you," she said, "both of you, right now while they're all downstairs." She glanced back over her shoulder at the empty corridor, then stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her. "I heard what just happened. The whole house heard it. And there's something you need to know before this goes any further, something about Julian and about what he's really doing here and about," she swallowed, "about why my grandfather Edward was cut out of this family 50 years ago, because it's connected, all of it, And if you're about to go to war with them, Miss Vance, then you deserve to know what they're actually capable of, what they did before, to someone who got in their way. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. The way they did it to my grandfather. The way I think they're about to do it to you. Alina looked at this frightened, resolute woman, and felt the shape of the story shift again. Felt a new thread appear in her hand, one she had not known was there, running back 50 years into the buried history of the family whose house she was about to inherit. "Sit down," she said quietly and drew out a chair, "and tell me everything." Catherine sat, and for a moment she simply looked at her own hands, gathering herself. Then she began. "You have to understand what this family was 50 years ago," she said. "When my great-grandfather was still alive, Thomas's father, the man who built the first of it. There were 3 brothers in that generation. Thomas, my grandfather Edward, and the eldest, William, who was meant to inherit everything." She glanced at Thomas. "You knew William?" "I knew William," Thomas said very quietly. Something had come into his face that Alina had never seen there, a kind of old, banked grief. "Go on, child, say it. I've waited 50 years to hear someone else in this family say it out loud." Catherine drew a breath. "William didn't die of a heart attack," she said. "That's the story. That's what's on the stone in the churchyard. That's what the family said for half a century. William Radcliffe, sudden heart failure, aged 41, God rest him, and the business passed to Thomas because Edward had already been pushed out, disgraced, sent away." Her voice tightened. "But that's not what happened. My grandfather knew it wasn't. He spent the rest of his life knowing it and being called a bitter, jealous liar for saying so, and dying poor in a schoolhouse in Northumberland because he wouldn't stop saying it." She looked up, and her eyes were bright and hard. "William was ruined first, the same way, exactly the same way, that they ruined you this morning, Miss Vance. I heard it through the door and my blood ran cold because I've heard the shape of it my whole life. A coordinated attack, business partners turning on him all at once. A scandal in the papers that came from nowhere. His reputation destroyed in a matter of weeks, his position gone, and then, when he was broken and alone, and no one would believe a word he said." She stopped. "Then he died," Thomas said, conveniently. "Of his heart." His hands had closed into fragile fists on the counterpane. "And I was young and frightened, and I let them tell me it was grief and drink that killed him. I let them hand me the company over my brother's grave. And by the time I was old enough and hard enough to ask the questions I should have asked, everyone who knew the truth was dead and the papers were gone, and there was nothing left but Edward, out in his cold schoolhouse, saying the thing no one would listen to." His voice cracked. "My own brother. I let them make me believe he was mad. It's the great shame of my life, and I have carried it for 50 years, and I am about to die still carrying it." The room was very quiet. Rain had begun again, softly against the glass. "Who is them?" Alina said. Her voice was level, but underneath it something had gone taut as wire because she was beginning, with a cold, prickling certainty, to see the shape of a thing she had spent 11 years chasing, from a direction she had never once expected. "You keep saying they, business partners, the people who ruined William. Who were they?" Catherine and Thomas looked at each other. "There was a firm," Thomas said slowly. "There has always been a firm. In William's day it was small, a merchant bank, a handful of men who moved money and moved men and were never quite in the newspapers themselves, only ever behind the people who were. They took a piece of the Radcliffe Company in William's ruin, and they took a piece of a dozen others the same way over the years, and they grew." He looked at Alina with sudden, terrible attention. "They're not small anymore. They're one of the largest privately held financial houses in Europe now, and they still work the same way they worked 50 years ago. They find a man or a company or a fund that's in their way, or that's found out something they'd rather stayed buried, and they don't argue with it. They erase it, all at once. A coordinated attack, partners pulling out on the same morning, a story in the press, a regulator who appears from nowhere and vanishes when the work is done." Alina did not move. She could not for a moment seem to make herself move. Say the name, she said. Thomas said it, and it was the name she had been carrying in a locked steel box beneath the floorboards of a servant's room for 11 years. It was the name at the center of the fraud she had found, the rot worth billions that she had said out loud one fatal morning before she could prove it. The men who had pulled her 3 biggest investors on the same day, and planted the story in the press, and conjured the inquiry from nowhere, and erased her so thoroughly that no one in the city would take her call. It was the firm that had killed her old life. And it was, apparently, the same firm, the same method, refined and passed down like a family recipe across half a century, that had destroyed William Radcliffe, disgraced Edward, and handed a frightened young Thomas an empire built on his own brother's grave. She had thought her war, and this family's grief were 2 separate stories that had happened, by chance, to be told in the same house. They were the same story. They had always been the same story. She had walked into it 11 years too late to save William and had not known, until this exact moment, that she had been walking toward it the entire time. "Miss Vance," Catherine said, "you've gone white." "Are you?" "Eleanor," Thomas said, and there was a new sharpness in his old eyes because he had been watching her face and he had seen the truth land on it like a blow. "Eleanor, the company you found, the fraud, the one that ended you, it was them, wasn't it, the same firm?" Slowly, Eleanor sat down in the chair Catherine had vacated. Her hands, she noticed with clinical detachment, were not quite steady, and it had been a very long time since her hands had done anything she had not told them to. "For 11 years, she said, I have believed I was the only person alive who understood what these men are. That I was carrying the one case that could bring them down, alone in the dark, in rooms like this one, waiting for a moment that would probably never come." She looked up, first at Thomas, then at Catherine. "And I walk into a dying man's house to nurse him, and it turns out he is the last living witness to the first crime they ever committed, and his great niece has spent her life guarding the memory of it. And the will he's just signed, the will his family is about to spend everything they have to destroy, hands the whole of it, the house and the money and the standing and the fight, to me." She let out a breath that shook slightly. "I don't believe in fate, Thomas. I've spent my life believing that things happen because someone with money and patience makes them happen. But I am sitting here trying to understand how, out of every house in England, I ended up in this one." "You didn't," Thomas said. Eleanor looked at him. The old man's face had changed entirely now. The grief was still there, but under it something had surfaced, something cold and deliberate and old, the shipping magnate who had stared out of the portrait with his hand on the globe and an expression that said he had learned to expect betrayal and had decided, quite calmly, to survive it. And beneath that, Eleanor saw, with a slow, gathering astonishment, something she had entirely failed to consider. "You think I hired a carer by chance," Thomas said. "A competent, unremarkable, replaceable woman in a uniform who happened to walk in off an agency's books 2 years ago." A thin, dangerous smile touched his lips, the smile of a man who has just revealed that the game was longer and stranger than his opponent ever knew. "Eleanor, I've been looking for you for 11 years. Ever since I read a small item in the financial press about a fund manager who'd found something inside that firm and been destroyed for it in a single morning. I read it and I recognized the method, my brother's method, the thing that killed William, and I thought, finally, someone else has seen them, someone else knows. And then she vanished, wiped from the earth, as though she'd never existed." Eleanor could not speak. "I'm a rich man, Eleanor, and a stubborn one, and I've been dying slowly enough to have the time," Thomas said softly. "It took me 9 years to find the thread, a name in Lisbon, a woman who bought papers and a history and a new life, and then 2 more years to be certain to have someone quietly place your name at the top of a very particular nursing agency's books, and quietly ensure that when the Radcliffe estate called requesting a live-in carer for a dying old man, yours was the file they sent." The smile widened, and it was terrible, and it was joyful, and it was the smile of a man who has spent the very last of his strength to win. You didn't wander into this house. I brought you here. I have spent 2 years lying in this bed, letting you believe you were tending an ordinary old man, waiting to be certain you were who I thought you were before I put a weapon like the truth into your hands. And this morning, his voice dropped to a whisper. This morning, at last, you told me who you were, and now you know why I left you everything. It was never charity, Alina. It was strategy. I have been building a weapon for 50 years, and today I've finished loading it, and I am handing it to the one person alive with a reason to fire it and the skill to aim. He sank back, utterly spent, his eyes shining. So, now, before those jackals come back up those stairs and before my heart finally does the thing they've all been waiting for, tell me your name, your real one. I've earned it. Let me hear it once before I go. And Alina Vance, who was not Alina Vance, who had been found across 11 years and half a continent by a dying man playing a game longer than her own, who had walked her whole life toward this room without knowing it, leaned close to the old magnate and told him her name. His eyes widened, because it was a name he knew. It was a name that meant something, still, in the quiet rooms where these things were decided. It was a name the firm itself would recognize the instant it was spoken aloud, and fear. Oh, Thomas Radcliffe breathed. Oh, they're going to be so frightened of you. He began weakly to laugh. They have no idea. They think they're fighting a carer for a house. The laugh dissolved into a cough, and Alina reached for him, but he caught her hand and held it, fierce and glad. You're going to finish it, aren't you? What William started, what Edward died for, what ruined you, all of it, one war, you're going to finish it. Yes, Alina said, and she found as she said it that the calm had come back over her, complete and cold and certain. The stillness Thomas had recognized on the very first night, the predator's stillness, settling into place at last after 11 years of waiting. Yes, I'm going to finish it. Downstairs, a door opened. Footsteps crossed the hall and started up the stairs, more than one set of them, unhurried, purposeful. The family regrouped, coming back. Catherine rose, white-faced. Thomas's grip tightened on Alina's hand. And Alina stood and smoothed the front of her carer's uniform and turned to face the door, no longer hiding, no longer small, no longer waiting, as the footsteps reached the landing and stopped outside, and the handle began slowly to turn.